Hey everyone, welcome back to the Learn with Life, where we dive deep into the untold twists of history that shaped our world. Today, we're cracking open one of the 20th century's biggest blunders, the Suez Crisis of 1956. But forget the headlines about tanks rolling through the desert or Nasser's defiant speech. We're zeroing in on the power play behind closed doors, how Harold Macmillan, the unflappable Chancellor of the Exchequer, turned against his boss, Prime Minister Anthony Eden, in a move so bold it toppled one leader and crowned another. This wasn't just a clash of egos, it was a seismic shift from imperial bravado to cold economic reality, one that humiliated Britain on the world stage and accelerated the end of its global dominance. Stick around, because this isn't just a history lesson, it's a masterclass in gutsy decision-making that still echoes in global politics today, from boardrooms to war rooms. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and let's jump in. First things first, why did a skinny strip of water in Egypt nearly sink the British Empire? Picture this, the Suez Canal wasn't just a ditch in the sand, it was an engineering marvel that redefined empires. Opened in 1869 after a decade of grueling labor that claimed thousands of lives, mostly Egyptian workers under French visionary Ferdinand de Lesseps, it carved a 120-mile shortcut through the desert, slashing the sea voyage from London to Bombay from 10,000 miles around Africa to a breezy 6,000. By the turn of the century, it was the lifeblood of British commerce, with the UK holding a 44% stake in the Suez Canal Company through savvy investments and a web of colonial influence. Fast forward to World War II, Rommel's Afrika Korps eyed it hungrily, and Churchill dispatched crack troops to defend it, turning the canal into a floating fortress ringed by minefields and anti-aircraft batteries. By the 1950s, with Europe's post-war boom in full swing, over half the world's oil, much of it from Iran's fields seized by Mossadegh before his 1953 CIA-backed ouster, snaked through those locks, fueling everything from London double-decker buses to Detroit V8s and powering the jet age's silver birds. Disrupt it, and you didn't just delay shipments, you choked the West's economic engine. Enter Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's firebrand president, a one-time history teacher turned revolutionary colonel whose charisma could fill stadiums and whose ambitions could topple kings. Rising from the ashes of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, where he tasted humiliating defeat as an officer, Nasser seized power in a 1952 coup, blending socialism, pan-Arabism, and fierce anti-imperialism into a cocktail that intoxicated the Middle East. He wasn't subtle, cozying up to the Soviets for arms deals via Czechoslovakia, funding Palestinian Fedayeen guerrillas to harass Israel from Gaza, and snubbing Western aid for the Aswan High Dam project, a monumental Nile flood control behemoth that promised electricity and irrigation for millions. When the US and Britain pulled funding in July 1956, citing Egypt's Soviet flirtations, Nasser retaliated with theatrical flair. On July 26, 1956, in a sweltering Alexandria stadium packed with 100,000 flag-waving supporters, he unleashed a 2-hour oration laced with mockery. "I will read out the names of the companies that will build the dam," he teased, then paused dramatically before declaring, "No, wait. The Suez Canal Company will build it. We are nationalizing the Suez Canal Company, effective immediately." The roar was deafening, fireworks lit the night sky. Shares in the Anglo-French consortium cratered 20% overnight. In London, champagne corks popped in Nasser's honor among nationalists, but in Whitehall? All hell broke loose, with Foreign Office cables flying like confetti. Anthony Eden, Britain's golden boy turned reluctant king, a patrician diplomat whose tailored suits hid a temper forged in the trenches of World War I. He'd waited 2 agonizing decades in Winston Churchill's shadow, serving as foreign secretary through the appeasement debacle and the Suez Canal Zone riots of 1952, where 13 British soldiers died in clashes with Egyptian protesters. Finally ascending to prime minister in April 1955 after Churchill's dotage-forced exit, Eden inherited a realm fraying at the edges, India gone, Malaya in insurgency, and Africa simmering with independence fever. To Eden, Nasser wasn't just a nationalist upstart, he was a modern Mussolini, a strutting dictator whose radio broadcasts from Cairo beamed propaganda across the Arab world, inciting riots from Tripoli to Tehran. Eden saw red, literally, as botched gallbladder surgery in 1953 left him dependent on benzedrine amphetamines, clouding his judgment with a fog of fatigue and fury. Influenced by his idol Churchill, who in private memos branded Nasser, this new Hitler, and urged action now, Eden convinced himself military force was the only antidote to creeping Soviet influence. "We cannot have another Munich," he thundered in cabinet, evoking the 1938 sellout that haunted his career. But here's where it gets juicy, straight out of a Le Carre novel. Eden didn't go solo. He orchestrated a clandestine tango with France and Israel in the sun-baked villas of Sèvres, outside Paris. On October 22 to 24, 1956, amid clinking cognac glasses and scribbled protocols, the trio hatched Operation Musketeer. Israel would launch a lightning invasion of Egypt's Sinai Peninsula on October 29, baiting Nasser's army southward to defend the frontier. Then, Britain and France, feigning neutrality, would issue an ultimatum demanding both sides withdraw 10 miles from the canal, knowing Egypt would refuse. This humanitarian intervention would justify Anglo-French paratroopers and carrier-launched jets seizing key ports like Port Said, all under the noble banner of protecting international shipping. It was a triple cross of Machiavellian elegance. Israel got revenge for Fedayeen raids, France avenged Nasser's support for Algerian FLN rebels, and Britain reclaimed its waterway. Cabinet hawks like Foreign Secretary Selwyn Lloyd and Defense Minister Walter Monckton, though Monckton harbored private qualms, cheered the audacity. The public? Blissfully ignorant, shielded by a de-notice gag order on the press that suppressed leaks, a censorship so tight it rivaled wartime blackouts and would later fuel scandals like the Profumo affair's media mistrust. Fast forward to late October, and the plot uncoils with ruthless precision. Israeli paratroopers, elite Sayeret Matkal commandos, drop from C-130s onto the Mitla Pass in Sinai, their Uzi submachine guns chattering as they overrun Egyptian outposts in a 100-hour blitz that captures 10,000 square miles. Nasser, caught flat-footed, declares martial law and appeals to the Arab League, but his Soviet MiG-15s are outmatched by French Mystiers. On November 5, as U.S. voters head to polls for Eisenhower's re-election, Anglo-French forces strike. HMS Albion Seahawk strafe Alexandria's runways, while 1,500 paratroopers from No. 3 Commando Brigade splash ashore at Port Said under naval gunfire that levels customs houses and sets oil depots ablaze. British Tommies, expecting fierce resistance, wade through shallows to surprising cheers from some Coptic Christian locals and disaffected Bedouins weary of Nasser's purges. Turns out, colonial nostalgia lingered in pockets amid Egypt's chaotic republic. Casualties mount, 22 British dead on day one, Egyptian losses in the hundreds, with civilian tolls disputed but tragic, including children caught in crossfire. Victory seemed at hand. Eden wires Churchill, "We have it under control." But triumph? It fizzled faster than a damp fuse. Why the rug pull? Because across the Atlantic, in the White House's wood-paneled Situation Room, Dwight D. Eisenhower, beseeching Ike to his adoring public, was apoplectic. The Supreme Allied Commander of D-Day now loathed colonial anachronisms, viewing Suez as a stain on America's anti-imperial crusade, especially with the Hungarian uprising raging against Soviet tanks in Budapest that very week. "This is a bad week for the free world," Ike growled to aides, torn between allies and optics as he chased a landslide win. No more old world empires dictating terms. America was the unipolar sheriff, enforcing its Monroe Doctrine for the Middle East via the new Eisenhower Doctrine. Retaliation was swift and surgical. Treasury Secretary George Humphrey sells off $50 million in British bonds, spiking interest rates. The Federal Reserve hints at denying swap lines, and the nuclear option, an OPEC-style oil embargo orchestrated with Saudi King Saud, looms, threatening to have Europe's crude imports overnight. Suddenly, Britain's gas pumps cough and sputter, rationing rumors electrify Fleet Street, with housewives queuing at garages like it was the Blitz. The pound sterling? In freefall, shedding 3% in days, hemorrhaging $45 million in reserves weekly as speculators from Wall Street to Zurich short gilts like vultures on carrion, sterling crisis that evoked the 1931 gold standard collapse. Enter our hero, or villain, depending on the lens, Harold Macmillan, the Eton-Oxford patrician with a walrus mustache evoking Teddy Roosevelt and a drawl honed in the trenches of the Somme, where shrapnel left him with a lifelong limp and a philosopher's detachment. As Chancellor since December 1955, Macmillan was Eton's unflinching bean counter, the supermac who balanced budgets amid ration cards while warmongers salivated over maps. A Tory moderate who'd flirted with Labour in his youth and authored prescient 1938 warnings on fascism, he grasped the fiscal fragility. Britain still owed $4.4 billion in Lend-Lease debts from World War II, its gold reserves thinner than a wartime soup. As Invasion Day dawned on November 5, Macmillan's ledgers screamed apocalypse. Foreign investors dumped £200 million in assets in 48 hours, a leaked Treasury memo, later declassified, pegged the war's tab at £100 million weekly, ballooning to £2 billion by Christmas if prolonged, equivalent to £50 billion today in today's inflated pounds. Run on the banks loomed, the Bank of England telegraphed panic. Macmillan, chain-smoking Chesterfields in his opulent Albany flat, huddled with advisors like Sir Leslie Rowan and U.S. Ambassador Winthrop Aldrich, crunching IMF projections that painted bankruptcy in stark red ink. November 6, 1956, the Crucible in Cabinet Room 10 at 10 Downing Street, a chamber heavy with cigar haze and the ghosts of empire. Eton, gaunt and amphetamine jittery, his once elegant features etched with insomnia, rallies his inner circle. We've seized the canal, now we hold it against the world if need be. War hawks like Julian Amory and Lord Hailsham thump tables in applause, visions of gunboats dancing in their heads. But Macmillan rises, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow, voice steady as a metronome despite the stakes. Prime Minister, he intones, eyes locking on Eton's, this isn't about maps or mandates anymore. It's about money, the mother's milk of power. The Americans aren't bluffing, they're bleeding us white. Eisenhower's treasury is auctioning our bonds, the oil taps could shut tomorrow. If we don't signal ceasefire by dawn, the pound collapses, inflation erupts, and with it, this government, and perhaps the party itself. Gasps ripple like aftershocks, Eton's face darkens to thunder, his pipe stem snapping in clenched teeth. Macmillan wasn't merely advising, he was staging a velvet coup, an ultimatum wrapped in loyalty. Whispers later revealed he'd primed the pump, prepping contingency loans from the IMF and even floating a radical devaluation, a heresy in Tory circles. In his 1972 memoirs, The Blast of War, Macmillan reflected, paraphrased for drama, it was the moment I saw the empire's sunset not in sand but in spreadsheets, glory yields to gravity. This was no petty squabble over tea, it was mutiny in pinstripes, a high-stakes pivot from saber-rattling to spreadsheet survival. Macmillan had burned the midnight oil on transatlantic scramblers with Fed Chairman William McChesney Martin, dissecting the dollar diplomacy noose. Without U.S. liquidity, Britain's convertibility commitments under Bretton Woods would shatter, triggering a domino of defaults from Canberra to Caracas. He knew Ike's outrage was genuine, fueled by CIA intercepts of the Sèvres talks leaked via French indiscretion, and that UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld was marshalling a 6,000-strong peacekeeping force, their Resolution 997 demanding withdrawal by November 10. Bold? That's putting it mildly. It was political judo, leveraging Eton's imperial pride against him, turning the PM's Achilles heel, his adoration for Churchillian resolve, into a fulcrum for retreat. The countermove clicked like a well-oiled enigma. Eton, besieged by Macmillan's math, howling UN debates in New York, where Soviet Foreign Minister Dmitry Shepilov thundered veto threats, and domestic howls from Labour's Hugh Gaitskell decrying the first aerial bombardment since Hiroshima, capitulates by November 7. Ceasefire wires hum, troops, 10,000 Brits and 30,000 French, pull back in a humiliating reverse gear, fully out by March 1957 after UNEF blue helmets take post. Nasser, bloodied but unbowed, keeps the canal, nationalizing it fully by 1958 and running it with Egyptian efficiency that soon swells tolls to record highs. Britain dodges fiscal Armageddon, Macmillan sweet-talks a $561 million IMF tranche and $739 million in U.S. bilateral loans by year's end, stabilizing sterling at $2.80 to the dollar. Yet the scars? Etched in acid. Eden's health implodes, chronic infections from his surgeries flare, nerves frayed to gossamer. He resigns January 9, 1957, at 59, a spectral figure fleeing to Rhodes for rest, his full-circle memoirs a bitter apologia haunted by Suez as his scarlet letter, polls plunging his approval from 60% to 25%. And Macmillan? The phoenix from the ashes, anointed PM on January 10 with 96% party backing, quipping to the press, "Most of our people have never had it so good," a soundbite that masked the grim calculus. His bold move transcended ambition. It was the hinge from gunboat diplomacy to checkbook realpolitik, jettisoning illusions of Pax Britannica for pragmatic alliances. Under Supermac, Britain dangled toes in the European common market, until de Gaulle's 1963 veto accelerated decolonization with the 1960 Winds of Change speech in Cape Town, and pivoted to NATO's special relationship with Washington, where JFK would later hail him as a grognard of the old school. Suez ripped the veil, America as unchallenged superpower, Europe as economic lifeline, colonies as costly relics, foreshadowing everything from Vietnam's quagmires to today's sanctioned skirmishes over Ukraine. So, what's the takeaway from Macmillan's masterstroke? Leadership isn't about charging blindly into the fog of battle, it's discerning the fiscal fog of war and slamming the brakes before the abyss yawns. Eden's hubris, amplified by illness and echo chambers, feels eerily familiar in our era of proxy conflicts, Twitter-fueled escalations, and economic mutually assured destruction. Who's our modern Macmillan, the whisperer in the corridors, armed with algorithms instead of abacuses, urging pause amid the clamor? Drop your thoughts below. Was Eden's folly the death knell of empire, or Nasser's gambit the birth of the multipolar Middle East? If this peek behind the curtain fired you up, smash that like button, share with a history buff, and subscribe for more hidden histories that hit different. Next up, the shadowy Sèvres transcripts decoded. Check the description for a treasure trove of sources. Declassified MI5 cables from the National Archives, Eden's tormented full circle, Macmillan's riding the storm, Nasser's speeches in philosophy of the revolution, and UNSC Resolution 997 transcripts. Thanks for watching, see you later.